Welcome to Understanding Islam, Series 3, Building a Just Society. This week we're going to look at the ethics of life. We're told in the Quran that when God created Adam, the first human being, God breathed into him God's Spirit, and this ennobled him, this made him human. Therefore, the human being is the bearer of the divine spirit. Sometimes this is called the human soul. Therefore, the human being is of great dignity in the sight of God. Indeed, the Quran tells us that to kill one human being without just cause and due process of law, it is as though you have killed all humankind. And to save one human life, it is as though you have saved all humankind. Therefore, life is of infinite value in Islamic understanding. Every human being is precious. Therefore, to save human life is a duty for all doctors, for all those involved in medicine. To look after our own lives is a duty upon every human being. And preserving human life is of such high ethical importance that even things that would ordinarily be forbidden are permitted if it's the only option that we have to save our lives. So we all know, for example, that Islam forbids the eating of pork and the drinking of alcohol. But if those things are absolutely necessary because there's no other food or drink to sustain human life, then they become permissible because they are serving that higher ethical goal of preserving human life. In the Arab society before the coming of Islam, one of the things that happened if you had too many girls within society is that they were simply killed. People would leave them out on the hillside overnight, or people would bury them alive. This process of female infanticide was totally explicitly forbidden by the Quran. Two important principles come from this. The first is that the human being should rejoice in the birth of a child equally, whether it be male or female. And secondly, that human beings should trust in God to preserve human life, to give us enough to eat and to drink. And we shouldn't take such a drastic measure as killing people out of economic necessity. The question of when does human life begin is important for all sorts of ethical questions, like assisted conception, contraception, and abortion. So when does human life begin is often tied up with this concept of ensoulment. When does the fetus change from being a mass of cells to having human rights, human dignity, and an independent human life? There are verses in the Quran that speak of the development of the human fetus in the womb in stages. First of all, there is a drop of semen which comes to a stationary place, and then it embeds, and then it turns into a mass, and then into a lump, and then that lump eventually is robed with bones and flesh, and then we have the developing human fetus. Now, there is a hadith of the Prophet that speaks about this early process being 120 days. And after 120 days, the soul is breathed into the fetus, and after that, it has human rights. Now, this 120 days can also be seen in the teaching of the great philosopher Aristotle. and Aristotle worked this out by observation. 120 days is about 17 weeks, and mothers will know that this is about the time that you begin to feel the child moving within you, so that it seems that life has quickened within the child. This moment of ensoulment then becomes the crucial point for most schools of Islam. There are some schools that actually see human life beginning at the moment of conception, of the fertilization of seed and egg. Sometimes in the affairs of human beings, it's possible that things just don't work, so that a couple can't have a child and conceive it in the normal way. And so in modern techniques, it's possible to assist them in the process of conception. This is sometimes called in vitro fertilization or artificial insemination. And semen are taken from the man, eggs from the woman, and they are brought together and fertilized outside the womb. And then, after waiting a while to make sure which are reproducing in a healthy way, then certain of these fertilized eggs are replanted into the woman, where hopefully they will grow into a healthy child. Now, it is a necessary consequence of this process that certain fertilized eggs are left over. And the question then comes, can they be discarded? The question of discarding these eggs hangs around the question of when you think that human life begins. For those schools of Islam that believe that human life begins with conception, then it becomes a problem to discard these surplus fertilized eggs, because you are then, in effect, discarding human life. For those schools who believe that life begins with ensoulment 120 days later, then it is acceptable to discard these fertilized eggs, because you are not discarding human life. Sometimes it is that the man and the woman are unable to produce the necessary semen and egg to have a child on their own, and therefore the question of donation comes up. Can we have an egg or semen from a donor? Now, some schools of Islam will say that this is an unacceptable practice because you are introducing material from a third person, and this breaks the matrimonial bond. It also means that the question of parentage of the child is uncertain. Now, knowing your parents is an essential part of Islamic law of personhood. Everyone is entitled to know who their birth parents are. So, anonymous adoption was not permitted by Islamic law, whereas fostering a child, that is, when children keep their own identity, that is a highly meritorious act. And this obviously has changed, with some countries bringing in legislation to say that all adopted children have the right to know who their parents were at some time later when they grow up. This means that for most schools of Islam, anonymous donation of semen and egg is not permissible. Some schools of Islam will accept that donation is possible, provided that the donor is prepared to be identified, so that the child has the right to know from where it originates, to know who are its parents. Obviously, we're talking here about a married couple who need assistance to conceive a child. Therefore, Islamic law wouldn't accept the use of artificial means of conception for a single person, for people who were living in a partnership without marriage, or for a homosexual partnership. When it comes to contraception, we know that in the time of the Prophet, people in that community practiced withdrawal, or coitus interruptus, as we say, and therefore it is permissible for Muslims to use contraception to delay starting a family, to space their children, and also when their family is complete. Completeness, of course, is a very personal choice, but generally the scholars point to the need to make sure that the human race survives, and therefore we need enough boys and girls to grow to become the adults of the future to keep the human race alive. For those Muslim groups who believe that life begins at conception, then certain methods of contraception will be unacceptable. Those will be those methods that destroy the fertilized egg. So, for example, the intrauterine device, the IUD, or the morning after pill will be unacceptable measures because they actually destroy that fertilized egg, and therefore for those schools that would be destroying human life. For other schools then, all those methods, including barrier methods, hormonal methods, will be acceptable, but not sterilization, because sterilization is to mutilate the human body. In general, Muslim schools will accept a pre-ensoulment abortion. That is an abortion that takes place during those first 120 days before the human soul is breathed into the fetus. Some schools say that this is a neutral act. That is, that the couple may decide to have an abortion if they so choose. Others will say that this requires justification. There has to be a good reason for doing this. Abortion is never something to be entered into lightly. Many Muslim scholars will say that it is necessary for the husband, the father, to agree in order for an abortion to take place, because it's a joint act and it must therefore be a joint decision. The only caveat to that position is to say that if the woman's health or life is at risk, she has rights over her own body, and she therefore can make a decision to have a pre-ensoulment abortion in her own right in that situation. Of course, Muslim scholars point to the importance of reducing the possibilities of abortion within society. They do not want to see the development of a culture of abortion. For example, in some communist countries, it became an acceptable and normal means of family planning. This sort of culture of abortion would be something that Muslim scholars would want to avoid, and therefore they place emphasis on the provision of adequate means of contraception, the provision of charitable trusts that would make sure that there were not economic necessities that would drive people to an abortion. In some modern Muslim countries, there have been developments to realize that modern life demands that the mother, for example, is also contributing to the family income, that there are a limit to the number of children that the family can maintain, and therefore they have increased the possibility of the acceptance of abortion, including in the cases of rape, for example. Our life is a gift from God. It is not therefore for us to decide when our life should end. And so human beings are not free to decide my life should end now. Therefore, suicide is forbidden within Islam. This also raises the question then of euthanasia. We can think of this as assisted suicide, asking somebody else to help me to take my own life. This is a serious thing within Islam because human life is sacred and is not something just to be extinguished. You can see this if you ask a Muslim, "How is your health? How are you?" And the typical response will be, Alhamdulillah. All praise is due to God who gives me the good health. So good health is something which is to be prized within human society. This means that the medical profession should strive to preserve good health wherever possible. Healing is part of human life. Suffering and illness is not something which is an inevitable part of human life. Indeed, we have an example in which the prophet is presiding over the funeral of someone, and the prophet says, "How fortunate you were that you died before illness touched you." So illness is not a necessary part of human life. It is to be avoided if possible. At the same time, illness is not something that is evil. Illness is rather seen as being something which is a trial upon the human person, a trial that requires trusting God, that requires patience to bear this suffering and this illness, but also something which is an invitation to the human being to discover the possibilities of healing. And therefore doctors are there to do all that is possible to prevent premature death. Preventing premature death reminds us that the Quran says on several occasions that every human being has an allotted lifespan, that God is the one who dictates when the human being should die. If God dictates that I should die today, then there is nothing that I can do. There is no power that is going to prevent God's will taking place. And so we're told that this is God's decision. God is the author of life, and therefore God is also the giver of death. So preventing premature death is an essential part of medical practice, but avoiding death, trying to postpone the inevitable death, is not something that human beings are actually capable of doing, because God will send death when God so chooses. At the same time, anticipating, that is, killing somebody before God's allotted time, whether by my own hand or assisting somebody to help me commit suicide, or for a doctor to actually kill me, these things would then be forbidden. So we can say that active euthanasia, that is, killing a human being, is a forbidden act in Islamic understanding. There is also, though, another dimension of euthanasia, and sometimes this is called passive euthanasia, or letting people die, allowing the natural process of death to take its course. This is acceptable because God is still determining the moment of death. So, for example, Muslim scholars will say that administering pain relief, preventing the suffering of somebody who is dying, is an acceptable and a good thing to do, even if the consequence is that it will shorten the process of dying and that person will die earlier, leaving God, of course, the decision of exactly when that person should die. In just the same way, modern medicine allows us to keep people alive through artificial use of techniques, of machines, to preserve human life. If that machine were withdrawn, then that life would end. And most Muslim scholars will accept that when such death is inevitable, it is permissible, after a process of consultation with the patient, if possible, with the next of kin and the family, and of course with proper medical judgment, it is then permissible to turn off that machine and allow the natural process of dying to take its course. Prolonging the process of death in an unnecessary way is prolonging suffering for the human being. This would be an unacceptable act. So it is possible then for the medical profession to relieve human suffering, even though the relief of that suffering will bring about the shortening of the process of dying. If you are turning off the machine, or if you are giving additional pain relief, you are not actively killing the person. The disease that they have is killing them, and God determines the moment of death. You can catch up with missed episodes of Understanding Islam by going to the Ahlul Bayt website On Demand section. And you can also download an article to go with each of these programs from my own website. Join me next week when we'll be looking at the importance of education for good within human society.